Okay, well, we are live streaming now, so welcome everybody. And we will just dive right in. I will share my screen and we'll get started. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, well, as everyone knows, this is our third meeting. We're going to cover a few topics today, so we'll start with the agenda. So first, we are going to do our administrative tasks. So I sent the meeting minutes around from the last meeting yesterday to you all. I have not received any requests for changes to that. So I guess I will open it to the floor now to see if anyone has a request to change, and if not, then we will move to adopting them.
Adam, just a quick question. This is Kevin at SAR. Are we concerned with, kind of minor grammatical things like condiment instead of conduit? Should they be corrected for the record, or what's the best form to do that? I don't want to take up meeting time to address that.
Sure. Yeah, I went through. I didn't happen to notice that, but I think that we could probably just go ahead and adopt and just agree. Kind of do similar to what we did with the bylaws, where it's like agree that I can go back and make any grammatical changes that are necessary. So I guess one thing to do before we do that, actually. There's a few folks on the call today that are new. So first, we have Jess Lowry, who's from our AG's office. So David Banis is our normal counsel for this board, but he was away on vacation this week, so Jess is filling in for him. So if we have any legal questions or issues that come up that we need legal advice on, she will be here to provide that for us. Jess, I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
I just want to say hi. Nice to meet you all, and I look forward to working with you.
And then we also have a few folks from Lotus. So the Energy Office has hired Lotus to facilitate this board. It did unfortunately come at a slight delay just because of timing of everything, but they are on board with us now. They're going to be helping with all of our presentations and facilitation of the meetings. Taking notes, that sort of thing, and also getting, providing any kind of access to, experts or information that you all need in order to do your work. So just wanted to give Kim Schlepfer, who is our project lead at Lotus, an opportunity to introduce herself and her team.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Adam. Great to be here. Really excited to work on this project with everyone on this board. My name's Kim Schlepfer. I'm a senior associate with Lotus Engineering and Sustainability. I know a couple of you, but for those I don't know, it's lovely to meet you, and I look forward to working with you. We've got Claire Cantor and Allie Mark, who are also Lotus team members, who you will see joining me for all of our future meetings. So thanks, and we'll be in touch and here to help. So thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kim. So now we will transition back to the meeting minutes. So I didn't hear anyone else other than Kevin have any comments. Open it up one more time to see if anyone else does.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Okay, please do.
Second motion.
Okay. So Ron, do you just want to clarify in your motion that it will allow me to make any grammatical edits that are necessary?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So all those in favor say aye, please.
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, well, it sounds like we have unanimous approval of the minutes, and I will go through and make any grammatical edits that we need, and I will be happy to share those once they are final in that way. So the next thing we will be moving to is the executive committee member announcement. So as you all may recall, House Bill 1362 set forth requirements for the executive committee. So we're going to announce the full committee and who was selected for that. And then we will discuss based on a couple of the requirements that were agreed to in the bylaws about, chair and vice chair, about whether we want to actually proceed with doing that or whether you all are comfortable with how we are proceeding currently. So we'll talk about that. The next item is during the last kind of tail end of the last meeting, we had a member who brought up a question about undertaking an independent cost analysis for the types of code provisions that you all are considering for inclusion in the model codes. And there was some discussion about the fact that needed to be noticed, needed to provide some opportunity for discussion, and then allow the board to actually take an official vote on whether or not to proceed with doing such a thing. So I have allowed time for us to discuss that for anyone who would like to propose, what type of study the board would be interested in undertaking. Anyone who wants to propose one will have the opportunity to. There will be some time for discussion, and then we will be able to vote as a body on whether or not to move forward. So that's what that line is. And then, much like our last meeting, we will be overviewing the example codes that we have in the state of Colorado for, in this case, for commercial solar readiness, residential and commercial electric readiness. And then in the next meeting, we will cover EV readiness for both commercial and residential buildings. And then after that, we will start diving into the actual discussion about adopting, like which provisions to adopt, discussing how to approach doing that. So that's kind of the schedule for today and what we're looking for in terms of the next couple of meetings going forward. Are there any questions on that before we move on? Okay. So we will jump right into the executive committee members. So as I said, House Bill 1362 required Director Tour and Director Garcia to appoint an executive committee. Essentially, the executive committee's role, which is outlined there on the bottom of the slide, is to step in and make sure that any code elements that are required under statute are being voted on and adopted as necessary. If the entirety of the board, or at least 2/3 of the board, is unable to come to consensus on any of those particular elements. So the requirements under statute were that the executive committee had to have 5 members. 3 of those were designated explicitly by statute, Director Tour, Director Garcia, and our building code expert, which is Brad Smith. And then the other 2 were to be selected from our county and municipality representatives. And at least one of them had to be a building official. In this case, both of ours just happen to be building officials, so that works out nicely. And so the county representative is going to be Ron, and the municipality representative is going to be Tim. So happy to take any questions on that, or give Will, I don't know if he's joined yet, he said he might be a little late, or Rick an opportunity to say anything.
Adam, it's Rick Garcia. No, I'm fine. I think you covered that quite nicely. I think it's just an official notification. There's no need for a vote. So thanks to the folks who actually were already designated as such to be on the executive committee, and those who agreed to serve in the other 2 capacities, county and municipal representatives. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Rick. So the other issue that I mentioned at the beginning that we need to discuss is under the bylaws, you all agreed to set forth essentially executive roles on the board. So the appointment of a chair and a vice chair, which would be from the executive committee, as we discussed. Obviously, to this point, we have not had a chair or a vice chair, and I wanted to give opportunity for members to discuss whether they think that the current structure as it has been working fine, where either I will manage the meetings or going forward, Kim or her team will manage the meetings, rather than having an actual chair doing it. And then there would also be more of a consensus-based process for making decisions about future meetings and agendas and all that, rather than us working one-on-one with a chair or vice chair. So if folks are comfortable with the way things have been going, what we would need to do is just amend the bylaws to remove the provisions relating to the chair, appointment of a chair and a vice chair, if there's anyone who feels strongly that we should have a chair and a vice chair still, then we would just maintain the bylaws as they are. So I'm open to discussion on that. Ron, please go ahead.
Sure. I guess I feel like it's been working pretty well under the current system, and I think I'd like to see that continue.
Tim?
I agree with Ron and Adam. It seems just like another layer of unneeded oversight, and you've been doing a great job. I think I would appreciate just moving forward as we've been doing that.
Thanks, Tim. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I support that as well. I think if your team feels like it has the capacity with the addition of Lotus to facilitate design agendas, serve the chair functions, it could be beneficial to have that both done from a neutral place, and then also to free up all participants to participate fully as participants rather than kind of jump into that more facilitator type of role. So I would support the recommendation as well.
Great. Does anyone have an opposing opinion? Okay, I'm not hearing one. So what we could do is just, if someone would like to make a motion to amend the bylaws to remove the provisions relating to the appointment of a chair and a vice chair, that would work. Tim, go ahead.
So moved. Or do I have to repeat what you said, Adam?
I would repeat it just for
all right. I'm trying to speed it up. No, I'm just kidding. I move that we delete the requirements for voting on or creating a chair and a vice chair to the executive committee.
We have a second.
Second it.
Great. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed, say no.
Hey, Adam, this is Rick. I'm going to abstain on that.
Okay. So I heard all in favor. I heard all yeses except for Rick's abstaining and no nos. So that is approved, and I will go through the bylaws and remove those appointment requirements and transmit that all to you at the end of this meeting with that updated language. Okay, so next we are going to move into the discussion about undertaking a potential cost study. And there were just a couple of questions.
Adam, quickly before we touch base on that, there was a question from Kevin as it relates to the bylaws.
Sorry about that, Kevin.
In the chat, just want to make sure we grab that.
Yeah, and it's maybe just one for council. We have the two director roles as, or designee listed on there, and our bylaws don't allow for a proxy. So it's really just a question for council: are we creating any contradiction there?
It's my understanding that the two directors are allowed to have a designee. It's just that all the other board members are not.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin and Jess. Were there any further questions relating to the bylaws? Not hearing any. So back to the discussion about the cost effectiveness study. So just wanted to pose a couple of questions to the group and then turn it over to anyone who would like to make a proposal about either discuss either of the two questions or make a proposal about a cost study that the board could undertake. So the first question is, I've shared with all of you a number of studies that have talked about these issues. They've come from PNNL, New Building Institute, Home Builders. I guess New Building Institute and NRDC did a lot of the analyses jointly. So there have been a lot of studies that have been shared relating to cost impacts on various elements. Not all of these proponents or not all of these studiers have done analysis on all three of the elements that we're considering, but between all of them, we've gotten analysis on each of those at some point. And so, I think one of the questions that needs to be considered is what information is missing from those studies, or what assumptions are being made in those studies that the board feels it would like to change for its own study. And then the second question, kind of along those lines, what assumptions would the board like to make if they are different from existing studies and the methodology that existing studies have used? How would the board want to move forward with different assumptions? So I'm open to conversation on that. Carolyn, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think first grounding it, I think the only purpose of doing a cost effectiveness study is if there's options available for us for consideration. And so, I think to the degree that we're focused on base code with just the provisions around electric ready and solar ready, I suspect that there's sufficient baseline there. I think what we probably need to answer for ourselves is the degree to which we also want to advance optional stretch codes within this first context. And then I feel that cost effectiveness will likely be something that we would want to do towards the second code update. So with the near carbon, because there may be things that evolve by the time we get around to that, or things that we want to consider within that that are unique to our context that may not be there. But just for the base code, I generally think that we have the information we need, because we're literally talking. I think the caveat, I'm going to give the caveat to that is depending on how we talk about electric ready in the commercial context. I think there's exhaustive studies on electric ready and PV ready in the residential context, and PV ready in the commercial context. So it's really what does electric ready mean in the commercial context is the only thing that I would flag. But I think we have to have that discussion about what we mean by electric ready in the commercial space before we can really answer that question. So those are my preliminary thoughts.
Carolyn, Andrew Harris, I would disagree with your position with respect to cost studies. I believe insufficient cost studies have been undertaken with respect to mandatory code measures with respect to residential and commercial mandates. The studies submitted and provided so far have not been complete or exhaustive, or have weighed the incremental impacts of items that the board will consider that are in front of it. And the most recent study submitted from the NAHB or on behalf of the NAHB did not sufficiently address, as many of these have not sufficiently addressed, the infrastructure cost and what it may take to service even an individual home, as some of the individual homes are addressed in servicing the entirety of the community. As many communities are designed years in advance, I've not yet seen a study that has sufficiently assured or addressed that each and every one of these mandates can be fully implemented as the code is implemented, that there tends to be a sufficiently duration of a lag between design and implementation in many communities. And I personally and professionally had thought that an independent cost study to address cost effectiveness prepared for the board as a basis of any proposed code or code proposal was necessary and essential.
So I know Kristen has her hand up, but can I offer a clarification to my comment and then maybe ask you a couple of questions? So it's my understanding that we don't have purview to refine the base 2021 IECC, and that we only have purview to set the requirements for electric ready and solar ready requirements that layer on top of that. And so in that context, I don't believe any cost analysis that determines the effectiveness of the 2021 IECC is within our purview. I wholly agree with you that as we look to the future code and our decision around whether it's based on 2021 or 2024, and any additional provisions, definitely requires more cost effectiveness. So within your area of concern, is it specific to the electric ready? So the electric capacity needs that are necessary to add additional circuits to the home, or the conduit and circuitry for the PV, or is it related to things like envelope requirements, performance metrics, lighting loads, and things like that?
Andrew, I believe some of that is to be flushed through and to be determined, and hence my request that an independent cost study for the board. The board has such competent representation on behalf of various members and industries that it feels like fundamentally it would be a weakness to not commission an independent cost study for the benefit of the board. I don't disagree that the 21 basis is the starting point, and hence any assessment of the incremental cost between the 18 or the 21 is part of the responsibility here, but taking from the 21 and prospectively going forward as the code language is drafted, voted, approved, it seems inherent upon fulfilling our duties to explore that every line item that is being considered, even to check or confirm that those line items are full and complete, to identify cost associated with each of the line items, to ensure that the line items themselves are the correct line items. I don't think an electrician present would, I would hope they would not disagree with that outlining what exactly is the intent or the scope to fulfill the intent so that one can execute it, that there's more clarity, and a cost study prepared for the board would help flush through that clarity.
So Andrew, I apologize to Kristen and Tim, I know you have your hands raised, and I think it'd be best to ask this question right after what Andrew said, and then move to your comments. Andrew, it sounds to me like I'm a little bit unclear as to whether or not you are suggesting that we undertake a cost analysis of whatever codes have been decided upon by this board at the end, or if you're looking to have a cost analysis done on like existing code language and to help inform what to adopt.
It may be a little bit of both. I think initially, first and foremost, it's as the board proceeds to make a fully informed decision on any item or element of a code, that those be assessed and a value be ascribed such that the items being assessed are thought through and understood before the vote is made on either that line in the code or the entirety of the code once it gets to the entirety. So it is more valuable as it proceeds. And I think it'll help many make a more informed decision as to the completeness and correctness. And it'll go to the home affordability aspect of the statute also.
Yeah, I would just make a comment on that from a logistical and cost of administration of that type of proposal. I think that would be, I'm not necessarily saying it couldn't be done, but it would be very challenging, because then we would be essentially commissioning a different cost study on each individual component of each individual code that we're considering. I mean, from what it's at, and please correct me if that's not what you were saying, but I mean, if you're talking, say, for example, the installation of a conduit and wiring between an electrical panel and, you know, the location of the, you know, gas furnace. I mean, if we're looking at specific cost of just that, and you're talking about taking an analysis of, you know, here's the different cost impact of different ways of looking at that language, and you do that for every single possible element that could be considered for the board, that is going to amount to a very, very difficult study. So I'm just curious to hear, you know, yours and other members of the board thought about how we could even feasibly approach a study of that nature, because that's going to be very difficult to do, especially with the time constraints we're working under. I mean, this has to be approved by April if you all are going to approve the final code. So any element has to be approved by April 1st. So we're talking about essentially 4 months here. And if every time we talk about an individual element, we have to wait for an analysis to be done on that individual element, I just don't think there's time for that.
It could, this is Andrew, it could be how any individual element is characterized. If I quickly read the definition in the statute of electric ready at where it goes adequate panel capacity, dedicated electrical panel space, electrical wire, electrical receptacles, and adequate physical space to accommodate future installation. I know that we'll start to look at model codes already drafted or implemented by others, and that'll help us formulate either individually or collectively opinions on each of these items. But many of the studies, I don't believe have fully thought through some of these elements in the definition when it comes to adequate panel capacity or even electric service, when if any individual home may be sufficient or the collective sum of the individual homes sufficient and what the ripple effects may be. I don't think the statute fully captures that. And how does the board even take that into account as a cost impact if every electric service needs to be upgraded? And that may not have been within the initial intent or scope, but that ripple effect should be assessed or valued. So whether or not each line item gets ascribed a cost, many of the studies may have items that whether a board member or somebody on behalf of the board selects from studies already done to assemble what we all think may be reasonably complete. It could be an alternate path.
May I chime in? I had my hand up for a while.
Yes, please.
Hi, so I wanted to refer everyone on the board back to some of the language in the legislation as passed that speaks about cost and maybe propose a potential path forward. So some of the language that I'd like to highlight is included. If you look at the enrolled bill, it starts on page 9, and it charges the Energy Code Board for developing not an independent cost study, but a standard methodology for determining how to calculate or measure when compliance with the model electric and solar ready code reaches a substantial cost differential. And then, our legislature defined for us what constitutes a substantial cost differential. In this case, the context is, when looking at commercial buildings. So to me, that says that before we even talk about developing an independent cost study, we need to agree as a board on what is the correct standard methodology for determining what constitutes a cost differential. And I do think that there could be some good sense in asking our support consultants to, present us with some different standard methodologies that could be used to determine or calculate when compliance reaches a substantial cost differential based on, studies that have been conducted. But it seems like we're talking a little bit past each other here before we really focus in on agreeing as a board what that methodology should be. And I would also highlight that when talking about cost differentials, the legislation charges us not just with looking at the cost differential to the builder, but also at the later cost to the building owners of having to convert. If we're approving a variance because of a 1% cost differential up front to a builder, then that may just push those costs down to building owners in the end. So I think as part of agreeing on a methodology, we would also need to agree on whether we're just talking about the cost to construct and build, or whether we're also looking at the later conversion costs for the building owners. So thanks for taking my thoughts there.
Kristen, I don't know if, before we go to Tim, I don't know if anyone wanted to comment or respond on what Kristen said. All right. Well, I guess we'll move on to Tim, and we can revisit if folks have comments later on.
All right, thank you very much. Actually, I was going to make a couple other comments, but what she just brought up, if I'm reading the section that she was applying to, which is that subsection, I guess it's 2A, that talks about a standard methodology for determining how to calculate the compliance reaching a substantial cost differential that would require a waiver or variance. So maybe I'm kind of misunderstanding that section, but that could be a question for council. But I'm going to go back to my two comments. I think, Adam, you made those 2 points I was going to ask the question on. Is number one, if the board chooses to go forward with some sort of cost effectiveness study, how is that funded? That's my first question. And then number two, I think you hit the nail on the head from a timing standpoint. I mean, the legislation is giving the specific dates for us to produce some adequate or acceptable and vote on the language. And I think April 1st is kind of that deadline. So you mentioned that's a little over 3 months from now. So we as a group have a lot to move forward with. And I'm not sure consulting or coming up with a third-party company to do this cost effectiveness study in that kind of time frame, I'm not sure how that's going to work with this without asking for an extension. Those are my comments. End question.
Thanks, Tim. Did anyone have anything to respond on what Tim said?
Hey, this is Will, and I very much agree with Tim. I mean, given the timelines in the legislation, I think that we certainly could have our consultants gather information from a variety of existing cost studies to share with us, but it's very hard for me to imagine that there would be time to actually do some sort of new original cost research as opposed to reviewing research that is already out there.
Well, Elizabeth, if you want to go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Yes, I want to thank Kristen for posting that language because I was looking for it. So that was really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, we've been tasked with finding that sweet spot between what minimizes the cost for builders and developers at the same time while minimizing the cost to the future building owner to eventually electrify. The question is not should we, but it's where does that line go between what happens in the new construction and then what happens as the existing building. I don't think we need a cost study to help us find that line. I think there's a lot of common sense there. There's a simple thing that can be done with just providing physical space. Like if we're a commercial building, one of the big things is physically finding space for those extra transformers. It doesn't mean we have to buy those transformers right now. The simple thing that, we as designers, and I see Kevin kind of nodding there, is to make the physical space for that fourth transformer to be added. It doesn't cost anything. It's just sort of that simple design that can be implemented now. And again, very low cost. It is then minimizing that future cost. So it's not the question of whether that transformer has to happen, because it does. So where do we find that line between lowest first cost now and lowest first cost later? And I think that is our task as the board. Thank you.
Thanks. Carolyn, go ahead.
Yeah, and I didn't have anything to add to that. I just wanted to make a note that we do have some viewers and not everybody's name is visible And there was a request in the Q&A to either introduce yourself or put your name so that the audience knows who's speaking.
So I agree. I think whenever anyone speaks, if you could just identify who is speaking before you start making your comments, that might help with that issue. Okay. Does anyone else have further comments or discussion on any of the points that have already been made? So I think just to address one thing for the context of what we're talking about, and especially related to what Kristen said, in reading the paragraph talking about the standard methodology, it seems to me that applies more specifically to the model electric and solar ready code as once it has been developed per se, not necessarily, and taken as a whole, not necessarily individual elements of that code, and especially until knowing what language is actually being chosen, I think it would be very challenging to develop a methodology for determining how the code at the end would be, a cost differential would be determined based on that methodology without knowing what the actual language that you all are adopting in the code. So that's just my interpretation in reading that paragraph, and open to comments on that.
So, Adam, Andrew Harris, can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't necessarily disagree with people can sense their way towards a sweet spot, but I'm not sure everybody, or at least the weight of the decisions that'll be made by the board, that the guidance by whether it's an independent study or somebody assisting with compilation or compiling pieces from multiple studies such that we have more of an informed basis upon which to make informed decisions on a prospective basis. Just some of the current studies don't really address that capacity and adequacy aspect. And I would very much like to see how that gets addressed, whether it's in the code or by a utility company, as to how each and every home out there is going to address this. If maybe panels have to be upsized or the service has to be upsized, and if so, what's the frequency? And is it just that every service has to be upgraded? Those are concerns that have been identified by others, but not yet fully addressed to my personal or professional satisfaction. And I'm not sure if all the board members are satisfied with how capacity is going to be addressed prospectively, that cost can be dismissed.
Rick, go ahead.
Thank you, Adam. Interesting conversation. I guess I'm curious, I don't know if this is staff or other board members to respond, but in the event that there was a study, either a new study or a confirming study or using the existing data that's already been made available to us, is there an expectation that the board will make decisions about not advancing certain elements of a new energy code because the cost considerations? I ask that because it may be moot that what the cost factors are if our expectation is that these elements have to be implemented regardless. So I'm just putting that out there. I'd like to understand that a little bit better.
Well, if I could just say something really quickly and then turn it over to you. I think I think that what the legislation is doing is setting forth very broad topics that have to be covered. So for example, at the very top for inclusion in the code, it speaks about it has to include electric readiness for residential buildings and commercial buildings. It has to include solar readiness for electric or for residential and commercial buildings. It doesn't necessarily weigh in as much on the very specifics of the language of the code, which could very much differ between. So I agree with you, Rick. I think that the legislation does set a baseline of the code does have to include, X, Y, and Z elements, but it's a matter of what the language included in those elements could potentially differ without necessarily running afoul of what the statute says, if that makes sense. And Will, I don't know if you lowered your hand, but I don't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, sort of very similar comment. Where I think the sort of deliberations around cost will be more significant is 2 years from now when we're developing the low carbon code, where there are, I think, many more decisions to be made about the low carbon code. In this case, we do have relatively clear direction from the legislature on the elements that need to be included. And so I think there's just much less, we certainly have some discretion, but substantially less discretion than we will have when we're developing the low carbon code.
Thanks, Will. Mary, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Mary Weiner. Just a reminder that if you haven't heard in the news, there is a transformer shortage for utilities. So most utilities are feeling that pain, and they're having to be very creative on maybe taking oversized transformers from some areas to another. So we should keep that in mind. Hopefully that supply chain issue will get resolved by the time this code goes into. And then I'd also like to, I agree with studies have a place, but I also think everybody on the board has some real life experience in seeing what's really happening in Colorado and drawing on that, not just the studies, what we're seeing works and what doesn't work, and drawing on our real life experience too. Thank you.
Mary, and I guess I wanted to also just give an opportunity for Kim and the team at Lotus to maybe give us an idea of how they might be able to pull together some information from the existing studies that might be able to help answer some of Andrew's questions without actually undertaking a separate study. So Kim, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I can't say that I have any mind-breaking thoughts at the moment. I think what we would want, what we would need in order to support the board in making that decision or pulling the right data is understanding, as we mentioned already, what are the options that we're considering, and then digging into reports and research to see if there are cost studies that look at the different options and what that might be. I'll also, to Mary's point, just emphasize that there are communities in Colorado with electric readiness codes in place that have been enforcing them. And so that expertise and knowledge of how these codes are working and what they cost to implement is right in our back door. And so we could also look at reaching out to municipalities enforcing this code and see if we couldn't get in touch with any contractors. But I'll just say right now, I don't have any sort of ideas on how to put that together until we have a better sense of what we're actually looking at.
Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Tim Pate here. So I just looked up some of the language, and we're talking about what the intent of this legislation is, I guess overall from the top down. And when I look at subsection, I guess it's 7, I can't tell, C1, says, in developing the EV and solar ready, the Energy Code Board shall, and then it goes on to say that buildings can be converted to high efficiency electric space water heating equipment and appliances at the lowest possible cost to building owners. And then the next section talks about doing an EV ready and solar ready that seeks to minimize the costs. So with that being said, I think Rick made a good point that it may be moot, but it should be part of the discussion to, and I'm kind of backtracking a little bit from my earlier statement, but to come up with some guidance on what the costs are, and then help us decide what route we're going to take to minimize the cost. We can't make a decision on how to minimize the cost if we don't know what we got to have kind of a menu of what the different options would be and those costs. So I'm kind of not quite done a 180 here, but I think based on the legislative language, it's part of our charge to, first of all, you got to start out with what are the costs and then how do we minimize costs?
Thanks, Tim. And I would just acknowledge, just briefly in response to that, I would acknowledge that many of the studies that we have looked at do acknowledge what the later retrofit costs are for all of these types of codes. And I think that very much goes to speak to, making sure that upgrades in efficiency and, for EVs and for electrification are at the lowest cost to the building owner or the homeowner relates to how much it's going to cost for a retrofit later on down the line, as opposed to doing it during new construction. So I just wanted to point that out, that I do totally agree with you that there is a specific directive on that. And I do think some of these later retrofit cost pieces of these studies do address much of that issue. We'll go to Chris next.
Oh, thanks. Hey, everybody, Chris Mingus. So just listening to the discussion, what's coming out for me is that if we were to embark on any type of, additional or refined literature review or, cost compilation, it should be focused on enabling us to make good decisions at the pace that the legislation requires. So within that, I wonder, if there is a kind of narrower menu of likely forms of solar or electric ready that we'll have to choose between. And if so, if there's a way to, pair specific elements of the existing literature or even a little bit of additional research from local governments that are starting to have some real experience and reportable data that we could pull together, on kind of like a menu of likely options that we'll have to choose between, and accepting that this is a best estimate, but giving us maybe a little bit more than we have, but not, slowing us down too much in something that's an impossible, set of multiple PhD theses stacked on top of each other.
Thanks, Chris. We'll go to Carolyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to kind of your original question, Adam, which is, I think that we should focus in on what we think is missing from existing information we have. And I feel a little bit like we've been talking in too high of a level of generalities to really answer that question of if there's a gap in the existing analysis. I've read through many of these and I'm really struggling to find what the gap is. I do very much agree with the earlier comment about we do have a deliverable of methodology to evaluate cost effectiveness that we should work on. And I'm assuming that Kim and her team are geared to really help us do that. Like I think that is a space that we don't have filled yet. But I'm really struggling within the context of what we're working on to really name the thing that's missing that would warrant additional study at this point. But I suspect we might find some. And so maybe it's about being at least a little bit flexible as we encounter those so that we can get some cost assessment at that time. I feel we're kind of spinning right now because it's just at such a high level and we're not really naming the it of what the trade-off is that we're actually considering. Or trying to figure out what the cost impact is. So that would be what I would offer.
Adam, Andrew Harris. The question may be, is the board sufficiently satisfied? And if the board is the board going to pick any one, or is it going to pick all cost studies or studies done to date to use as a basis to make an informed decision? The weaknesses, I believe, of many of these studies is they do not consider capacity either from the panel or the service, period. It's a fundamental flaw of most of these studies is to do users, a user being a builder, a developer, or a even ultimately a buyer who has to make a conscious decision at some point down the road must designs be redesigned to stay within a certain capacity or whether panel or service capacity, or must existing homes be expanded to increase capacity, including the panel and service, and what might that do to not just the home, but ultimately to the cost of the service of the community. Many of these communities that many builders are not the community developer, many builders are just purchasers of lots in a community, and the existing service that's being put in today may not be sufficient depending upon what path comes from the decisions that the board makes, whether it's one of the first couple or the third one. And most of the cost studies, I believe, have kind of alluded towards this, but none of them have really hinted on that. It might be great to have an opinion by our utility providers as to what's their view or belief. And is it worth, if a cost study is not undertaken, to at least get an opinion from the utility providers across the state? Can the communities be serviced capacity that is being requested by any one or more of the elements? Is it sufficient that they can be served?
Hey, Andrew, I feel the obligation to chime in here as the energy efficiency rep on the board, and also as someone who happens to be on the board of directors of one of our state's rural electric utilities. You bring up a very important point, which is that capacity is important. Obviously, oversized panels create an additional cost. But I think one of the keys here, and one of the things that is actually touched upon in some of the studies and in some of the other stuff that's going on in our wonderful state, is that a lot of these capacity issues can be addressed by technology and efficiency and planning. So, the legislation here didn't require that all buildings in the state be upgraded all overnight at once. So that provides, it's not like all of our utilities are going to be expected to upgrade all the distribution lines all at once. It's much easier as a utility to plan when you're planning for new construction or when you're planning for a new community development. So, there is that time. And then when it comes to when there are capacity constraints, there are service panels that do allow scheduling and the ability to switch between loads. There is now increasing integration within appliances of batteries, which can help reduce those peak loads, which can help minimize panel size. And I think there's some really exciting stuff going on with demand response capable appliances as well. So I just wanted to point out that there's multiple ways to approach this potential problem, and that I think it need not be a barrier for us completing our mission. Thanks.
Kristen, we'll go to Elizabeth.
Yeah, hey, this is Elizabeth, and I'll just continue what Kristen just said. So I'm your professional engineer representative, and I'm also an energy nerd as well. So I think I agree with you, Andrew. The studies do lack cost information on the capacity increase. They all just sort of gloss over it, and I actually think for the purposes of this board, that's okay. As Kristen says, we're not necessarily defining a timeline at which the home or the building is being upgraded. It could happen in 1 year, it could happen in 20 years, it could happen in 100 years. So what we've been tasked with is defining what in the electric ready code is most cost effective to encompass all of those situations, the 1 year, the 5 year, the 100 year. Or, what do we define as that? Is maybe we also consider that. I think it's also premature to even define what that upgrade capacity might be. As Kristen notes, technology is advancing daily. We've got new toys now that we didn't have a year ago, and I'm sure we're going to have even more new toys in 5 years. And, with demand response capabilities, maybe we're not talking as huge of an upgrade in 10 years as we would be today. So I think that needs to be part of the discussion of where does that line get drawn for what's cost effective to implement today. And I would, we're probably getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I would argue that defining what that capacity is today is not as cost effective as defining that capacity in the 1 year, 5 year, 100 year, based on what the future technology would be. I think that has to be part of that discussion. I doubt that we will find a cost study that defines that, but I also don't think we necessarily need those numbers. I think, again, this is kind of going back to common sense. Like, is this going to cost more today, or is this going to cost more tomorrow to implement? And then still finding that line about what goes in the code today. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Does anyone have any other comments that they would like to make? I also noticed there were some comments in the chat too. If, that might be beneficial to open to discussion as well. If anyone who commented in the chat would like to speak to those, but we'll go to Brad next.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, hi, everybody. This is Brad Smith, City of Fort Collins. I think to Elizabeth's point, we do also have some flexibility to adapt the code where there might be considerations for a utility and capacities it can't deliver, and maybe would require a transformer upgrade or a feeder upgrade. So I think it's probably key to just keep in mind that we can sort of adapt the language around that if needed. Just a consideration.
Thanks, Brad. Anyone else? Mary, go ahead.
Hi, Mary Weiner. So I know there's been a lot of concern. Excel has a video out. All rural electric co-ops are aware of the electrification movement and definitely upgrading the grid to handle the extra solar, the wind, and then electrification. So that's a valid concern. But Platte River Power Authority, Tri-State, all the big players in the state are working on that and looking forward to the electrification. So we are addressing that. And the biggest issue right now is the transformer shortage. And so utilities just have to get creative, where a lot of times, just like our heating and cooling, we oversize. So we oversize transformers. So we just have to kind of shift them around a little bit. But all the utilities are looking at what electrification is going to mean and doing what they need to the infrastructure.
Thanks, Mary. Anybody else? Okay, so not hearing anyone else immediately. Anyone else who wants to make any comments, please do feel free to raise your hand or jump in. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, so my recommendation, if we're getting closer to maybe taking a vote of some sort, would be to recommend that our consultant Lotus pull together some information from the various places where they can, whether it was existing communities who have adopted and have some kind of background, or pulling pieces and parts out of the various studies to put together nice white paper, 1 or 2 pages to bring back to the board. I think that would be the first step, and not having to recreate a whole new study, but to put together. That would be my recommendation if this makes it to a vote at some point.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that? And Andrew, I guess I would ask you specifically. You were jumping in. There you go.
Tim, I'd support a position like that compilation or pooling or extracting from already prepared information. Elizabeth even brought up something that, whether it's appropriate, timely or not, it is appropriate that something such as a smart panel Is that something that the board may eventually consider? Is that something that should be weighed in incremental cost in a study? Now, the time may be a little not yet ripe to consider that, but I think that is a item that warrants at some point a discussion. But I do support and like what Tim proposed to work within the time frame that the board has to accomplish everything it's seeking to accomplish.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'll just note that Kim from Lotus did put in the chat that they would be more than happy to pull together that information if that is what you all decide to move forward with. So opening the floor to anyone who may disagree with that perspective or position.
And Adam, if it's okay, I just want to make sure I'm understanding, Tim, your recommendation in full. You're recommending that we pull together information from existing studies and from communities that have this in place that might not have been studied. So kind of taking it from both of those angles, or more of a literature review of what's out there and pulling that together into some short white paper.
I think, I had not thought, I think you or someone else had said that since there are communities that have already adopted different varieties of the EV ready and the solar ready, and I don't know how much data they could supply. You mentioned maybe some contractors who work in there, but I think the consolidation of any of that info, if it's there and it makes sense, credible, and more importantly, like pulling out the different parts of all those studies. I mean, I went through a lot of those studies, and I read a lot of code books all the time. I mean, it's what I do for a living, and I got lost quickly in a lot of those with the technicality. So I would appreciate some of the experts to say, okay, these are some things, and putting them together into some kind of table that makes sense. So it would be a mixture of both.
Great. So I didn't hear anyone. Oh, Kim, go ahead.
Sorry, just trying to unmute here. I just wanted to bring up the aspect that would potentially contribute toward or adds nebulousness to cost studies, is that not only is technology changing and the cost of things implementing them changing, but we also have a huge federal stimulus funding package that is being figured out that provides, at least for one example, it will provide funding for people to upgrade their homes if their electrical panel service is not sufficient. It's also providing a lot of grant programs for utilities to apply for to increase their stability and cost of grids to then support the technology as it's changing. So there is a moving target also when you look at cost effectiveness with all sorts of grant and stimulus funding coming down the pike to help support change. So I just wanted to point that out in this context of this conversation.
Thanks, Kim. Tim, go ahead.
Thanks, Tim Pate. Kim, based on that comment you just made, are those grant programs going to be available to new builders, whether they're, say, residential builders or commercial builders, or more just in line with existing retrofit?
From my understanding, because all of that funding is coming from the federal government, then through the state, and then going to be offered statewide, at least if we're focusing, here in Colorado, which for the purposes of this board we are. To answer your question, it's still a bit unknown as to the exact programs and grant opportunities, et cetera, that everybody will be eligible to apply for. I do know of several opportunities that are already being planned on by the Colorado Energy Office. One that we're going to support our local co-op with applying for this coming spring related to microgrids. So I think those programs and grant opportunities and who can apply for the funds and whether it's new construction, et cetera, is still a bit to be determined. I think some of it's very established, but still not sure how it's going to roll out. And the rest of it is still under discussion, is my understanding so far.
And Tim, I would just add to that too. A number of the programs did have a certain focus on existing buildings. However, some of them did include eligibility for certain improvements. I can think of one in particular, the high efficiency electrification rebates for residential buildings. And that one in particular does explicitly spell out in the statute that it is both for new and existing upgrades. So for example, panel upgrades or wiring or things like that could be used theoretically for new builds as well as existing. Sorry, go ahead, John. I muted before I said that.
Just a couple quick things. A good discussion here. The two things we need to remember. Number one, we're asked to be placing a minimum standard here, and this is probably the most critical part, is what we pick as that minimum, and that's why I think these cost evaluations will be beneficial. I get real nervous when we start talking about trying to plan in the future based upon grant monies that we don't know about for sure that are going to be long-term. These codes are going to be long-term. Grants come and go constantly. So we need to be very cautious if we're going to be planning for anything that we think a grant's going to cover cost in, because that is not a for sure thing.
Some of these are not grants, they're changes to the tax code that last for 10 years. So that is a known time period.
Agreed, but it's still a code doesn't typically reverse direction very often.
Sorry, Carolyn, want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I just on that topic, I feel like this is definitely into the cost effect, like how to demonstrate it's not cost effective discussion as opposed to a code discussion. Like the factoring in the availability of other sources certainly should factor into whether someone is exempt from complying with the code due to cost effectiveness, but I'm not sure how it fits into the code explicitly.
Kim, you want to go ahead?
Just to respond, I agree. And I didn't mean to kind of sidetrack the conversation there. It was just more that even the cost of implementing things does change into the future as well. So it's all a bit challenging to put into exact black and white conversation for studies.
I think we probably all agree that cost to some degree is always a moving target. Supply chain issues, workforce related issues, cost of material issues all contribute, as well as, of course, any sort of subsidies provided by the government. So I'm sure, I would assume that everyone probably would agree with that sentiment. Were there any other comments on this discussion? I do think, just for the sake of time, if we could, kind of come to a decision on what you would all like to agree to unanimously on the next step, or would like to take a vote on, whatever that may be. I know Tim did make a specific recommendation. I don't know if anyone would like to comment specifically against that recommendation, because if no one is against that, I would assume that we could probably just vote on moving forward with at least doing that straight away, and then discuss whether or not to do anything additional to that. But Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tim Payne again. Maybe my question would be to help the board on making that decision on how to move forward is, what would be a time frame when we might be able to see something? I know we're in the holiday season and a lot of people taking a lot of time off. So would it be like a month, 2 weeks, or a month, or 2 months?
I think that is a Kim Schlepfer question to see about timing for how quickly Lotus could pull that together. I will note that our next meeting on January 11th is going to still kind of be a discussion about existing code examples on EV readiness. And so I think our first true discussion on actual inclusion of what elements to include in a code, or what elements to at least propose for inclusion in a code, would start around January 23rd. So that's about a month and 2 days from now. So just for that general context. Kevin, if you want to go ahead, or I think Chris had his hand up first, and then we'll go to Kevin.
Thanks. Well, I was going to say, I mean, I support Tim's general recommendation if Lotus feels like they have the direction they need from us. An open question from me, Adam, since you were talking about, code elements we might consider, is whether, that's clear enough to Lotus now, or whether we want to wait till we've identified code elements and then have them compile something based on those. But generally support the approach.
Yes, Kevin, if we can skip to Kim just really quickly to answer that question, and then we'll jump to you.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate Chris bringing that up. I think as far as timeline, us compiling, a quick summary of all of the studies that you guys have been sent as far as what they are communicating about cost impacts for these different elements. We would likely be able to accomplish that by the January 23rd board meeting. As far as, taking it that next step to go do the outreach to communities who have these pieces in place, I think we would want to make sure we're, I think we would want to have a little bit of back and forth with either the CEO or with the board to make sure that the questions that we're asking are related to the policies we're considering. So I might suggest, but open to all thoughts and feedback, we take that first step with combining in sussing out all of the cost data from the studies that we already have in the immediate near term. And then once the board has had a chance to look at all of the options and discuss where they'd like to see the cost analysis, maybe at that point we could sort of further figure out what the questions and metrics and incremental versus upfront pieces are, and then conduct the second half of that cost study to look at the options that have been decided on. So that might be what I recommend. If we want the second part now, I think it would take, to Chris's point, just a little bit. I would need to kind of think through a potential methodology and have some back and forth with board members to make sure that that meets the intent.
Kevin, go ahead.
Thanks. So I've been trying to craft a motion that might move us forward, and I can throw it into the chat for the sake of the minutes keeper. But is it okay from just point of order? Is it possible to offer a motion?
I would just say that I would open it up to any final conversation relating to what Tim and Kim were discussing, and Chris, what all they proposed with moving forward with, at least in the immediate term. And then if there's no further discussion with Kevin, I would turn it to you.
Yeah, you bet. And I can throw a draft of the motion in to see if it's acceptable to people.
That'd be great.
How it goes, yeah.
Is there any further comments or discussion or points that anyone would like to raise relating to the proposed path forward for what we're deciding? Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, what Kim just said about from a timing standpoint, I would support just moving forward. And this might help, I don't know, on the motion, Kevin, just to move forward with consolidating the costs that they can pull out of the various cost studies. And my opinion would be to break that up into two components. One would be estimated costs on new construction, and then estimated cost on alteration, retrofit type, so we can break that apart. And I think that's going to help as we move forward in getting into the weeds with the details, because we might come up with certain requirements that we go with on new and then break it up on the existing. That's would be my opinion. Thank you.
Any further comments? Seeing none, I guess, Kevin, we will turn it to you to make that motion.
I'll give it a try. I didn't finish typing it yet. So I propose a motion that the board vote not to pursue independent cost study, but request an analysis from Lotus on variations between cost analysis models for context and evaluation, as well as soliciting input from municipalities regarding cost data from implemented codes. I'll finish typing that for people to be able to evaluate it.
Do we have a second on that motion?
I'll second.
Before we vote, Kevin, Andrew, if I could ask, is the first part necessary or is the second part by itself adequate? Does one have to move in?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. The reason I was suggesting that is because it's on our agenda and it's kind of on the screen right now of saying, we need to decide whether or not to take an independent study. So with that motion, I'm trying to clarify that due to time constraints, we don't have time for an independent study, but that we do take a closer look at what's available, both from shortcoming and what's out there, as well as understanding what we have from analysis around the state who have implemented it.
It seems like an important clarification to me.
Kevin, was your intention that this study through your language would also include an evaluation of how municipalities that have adopted these codes are measuring cost differentials to help us implement our obligation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any further questions or comments on the motion?
It would be helpful when Kevin finishes typing just to see it in the chat to make sure we've got the language down, if that's okay.
We can give it a minute and let Kevin put that in the chat, and then everyone can read it and make sure that they fully agree with everything in there, and then we will either amend his motion or request to amend his motion, or we can move forward with a vote on the motion as presented.
I'm pretty sure this is what I said. Sorry.
So, Kevin, Andrew, would the motion be limited from the discussion for the EV and solar ready and the more broad TBD is still a question as to where that may go?
Would that be with respect, Andrew, to the, sorry, this is Kevin. Would that be with respect to whether we vote to undertake or not, or as to what we do with the data that Lotus is collecting?
The scope of the motion, that would it be broad and applied to the entirety or just the current in front of us?
My intention is that it's for this matter in front of us.
So Kevin, I guess, would you be open to modifying it to say I propose a motion that the board not pursue an independent study on the model electric ready and solar ready code? So it's very specific to this code and does not implicate the low energy and carbon code down the road.
Yep. Amendment accepted. Thank you. More formally.
Okay. Are there any other now that that's been put in the chat and with that modification, are there any further discussion or comments, Ron?
I guess I'm just curious, do you think that clarifies that we're looking at existing cost studies for that purpose?
Perhaps maybe just to clarify that, it could say request an analysis from Lotus on variations between existing cost models, various existing cost models.
I think that'd be helpful.
So this is Kevin, I'm adding that into the chat so there's the third iteration there. I just posted. Who's that?
Any further requests or comments? Okay, hearing none since it's been amended. Kevin, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Sorry, just my one comment would be I think in terms of our own expectations, we might want to acknowledge that some of the municipalities might not have a ton of data yet. I think it's worth pursuing, but I just wanted to mention that just so we're all aware. But I support the proposed language and look forward to seeing what Lotus can find.
Thanks, Chris. Kim, if you want to go ahead.
Just one more question regarding clarification regarding municipalities. Do we want to clarify that it's Colorado municipalities, or do we want to have it open across the country for research by Lotus?
My understanding was probably that it was originally intended to be limited to Colorado municipalities, but
That's what I thought as well, but if it might need to, the word might need to be added in there if that is the case.
does anyone have concerns about adding the word Colorado before municipalities?
I accept the amendment. That was my intent. This is Kevin.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So, any final comments or questions? Okay, I'm not hearing any. So Kevin, since it's been amended, I would ask you to make the motion again.
Sure. So I'll restate the motion. This is Kevin with SAR. I propose a motion that the board not pursue an independent study on the model electric ready and solar ready codes, but to request an analysis from Lotus on variations between various existing cost models for context and evaluation, as well as soliciting input from Colorado municipalities regarding cost data from implemented codes.
We have a
I'll
second.
second again.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, no. Okay, so the motion is unanimously approved. We will, CEO will work with Lotus on getting the requested information put together. And we will, if not, depending on timing, if not by the next board meeting, certainly in time for the January 23rd meeting when the initial discussions relating to code element consideration will begin. Great. Well, thank you all for a very interesting conversation and for remaining civil. I know that some of these topics can be very challenging and very frustrating. So I appreciate all of you handling it this way. So if there are no further questions or comments on this topic, we will move on to our review of commercial solar ready codes that have been adopted in Colorado. Okay, hearing none, we are going to move on. Okay, so this is picking up off of our discussion from the last meeting where we covered residential solar ready codes. I think folks are going to see a lot of consistent analysis in this language as well, but there are some differences that I think are important to note. So just a general overview, 7 Colorado jurisdictions have adopted some version of a solar ready requirement for commercial buildings. I will note that I believe that Erie is in the process of potentially adopting amendments that are relating to solar readiness, but have yet to actually adopt them. I do discuss Erie more down in the electric readiness codes, but I did not include them here because most of the language was very similar to other jurisdictions that are listed here. So 3 of the 7 have adopted exact language from the 2021 IECC Appendix CB, which, as I noted earlier, is pretty similar to Appendix RB, the residential appendix. 2 of the 7 have adopted the 2021 IECC Appendix with amendments. And then Crested Butte has adopted both solar ready and solar required elements depending on the size of the building. And then Boulder has adopted its own language, similar to Appendix CB, but differs in a few ways. And then Wheat Ridge adopted only the requirement that panel space has to be reserved for future solar. So they did not include anything else relating to solar ready zones or wiring or anything of that nature. So much like residential, there are provisions requiring the identification and location of solar ready zones. Many of the same elements are included relative to how is the what direction is the solar or is the roof facing, what size there has to be for the solar ready zone, so that identifying a minimum required size, and then exceptions relating to shading, buildings that already have existing on-site renewable energy plan, or buildings that are deemed not suitable by a contractor or code official for a solar ready zone. A few of the differences between the codes are in the inclination. Boulder is different than most of the others. Most of the others said that the roof has to be facing within 110 to 270 degrees of true north. Boulder has a slightly wider range of 90 to 270 degrees. Size kind of varied as well. So the IECC appendix stipulates a minimum of 40% of the roof area. So all the jurisdictions that adopted that also have 40%. A couple of the others who adopted similar language also did 40%. Denver did up to 60%. So the 60% of the roof is required to be identified as a solar ready zone. And then most of them have requirements about minimum sizes. If the solar ready zone is not one contiguous space, that it has to be at least, in most cases, 80 square feet. And the smallest dimension could be 5 feet in width in any one direction. And then, as I noted, the exceptions that are pretty consistent across the various jurisdictions relating to shading, any roof that's shaded more than 70% of daylight hours, buildings that already have plans for on-site renewables, or for other reasons are deemed not suitable for a solar ready zone by an architect or a contractor or the building official. Unique requirements. So I'm honestly not entirely sure what I was saying in that sentence. I know that Denver, I think what I was trying to say in that sentence was that Denver does have minimum solar ready requirements. So if you have installed solar on your building at a certain minimum level or greater of capacity, then you no longer have to identify a separate solar ready zone. So I think that kind of pairs similarly with buildings that have on-site renewables, is that Denver actually explicitly set a minimum capacity that installed solar or other renewables has to have in order to exempt them from identifying a solar ready zone in it. Kristen, if you have a question.
Are there any exemptions for green roofs?
Not that I have seen in the codes from this.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Mary, go ahead.
Mary Weiner, so when you guys have a size range, a lot of utilities have adopted, it used to be 120% of the annual kilowatt hour usage is what a utility would limit a customer to size their system. Excel went up to 200%, and some utilities have adopted that too, to allow the customer to size the system up to 200% of their annual kilowatt hour usage. Now, of course, the board won't know the kilowatt hour usage because that belongs to the customer. But I'm just wondering, I'm not sure how the utilities versus a state code saying you have to do it this, and a utility saying you can only size it up to 120 to 200%. So that's just a question.
Elizabeth, were you planning to answer Mary's question, or did you have something else?
I was going to contribute, having done lots of solar sizing for lots of different buildings, it would be very, very rare for a building to have solar that covers 40% of the roof area and exceed 125 to 200% of the demand.
Yeah, and I would note too, I think what this is saying is that 40% of the roof area has to be identified as being a solar ready zone. That doesn't necessarily mean that 40% of the roof area has to be covered in solar panels.
So I guess I don't see that as a hindrance necessarily.
Carolyn, you had something to add?
Yeah, I haven't gone back and looked at this, but I feel like the difference between these is through what else needs to be on the roof space. And it's probably worthwhile to look at the two extremes to understand what they assumed as to other items that have to be located on the roof space to determine what's available. I think our goal should be to maximize the designation of space, recognizing what else needs to be available, and then also seeing kind of practically like what's the percentage of buildings built within each range to see what success looks like. I think we could probably do a little bit of homework around that and narrow this down. I suspect it's as we move into areas with lower insulation, it probably gets more challenging, but also I think we talked previously about, the architectural features. Like we don't want to encourage that to by going too low either.
Yeah. Elizabeth, did you have something else?
I was just going to chime in the appendix, the Solar Ready appendix that's part of the current IECC that a lot of jurisdictions just adopted verbatim, kind of addresses that as far as mechanical equipment, things on the roof, roof eaves and whatnot that can make a, limit the actual panel area. That's kind of written in right now. There's basically just an out, like, I, as your engineer, could say it is not feasible to achieve 40% solar ready area on this roof because of XYZ. So that's kind of written in there. That could be something that we could look at amending from how the IECC language is right now. And I'm not sure, Carolyn, that answers your question, but someone has thought of that. So we can look at what that interpretation was and see how we feel.
Yeah, and I think is that what's reasonable factor that I was really kind of referring to. Like you said, it's just an out. And I don't think we want to go that far, but also landing what's reasonable.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's. Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just going to say it's been rare that I've had to use that exception. It seems to be the very tall, skinny buildings that just don't have any roof area left after you put a cooling tower and stair access and whatnot. That there literally isn't 40% of the roof area left. I haven't really seen anybody try to game the system per se. It usually works out. 40% feels like a good number.
Yeah, and I think too. I think the establishment of the minimum sub area of being 5 feet and 5 feet wide and 80 square feet tries to make it so that you can't put too many things on the roof to obstruct all of those sub areas. And then also there is some of the codes do have language that say that it is a percentage of the roof area excluding any area that is covered by an obstruction, right? So like if there's a chimney or something, it excludes that in the calculation. So I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can go about figuring out the specific language to make sure that folks can't game the system, but also are, meeting the requirements. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Sorry, I just forgot to put my hand down, Adam.
Oh, no problem. Were there any further questions or comments?
Adam, I did want to flag one thing. Oh, sorry, Mary, I hopped ahead of you without putting my hand up. That there seemed to be, and I just, based on the sort of document you pulled together for the board, which was incredibly helpful, differences between a couple of the communities as far as the electric storage readiness goes. So the electric storage readiness is, I think it's 103.7, and then 103.8 also talks about, labeling for future electric storage. It seems as though a couple of the communities that you pulled examples from don't have that explicit language or have it listed differently. So I just wanted to flag that as a difference or sort of a unique aspect to some of the adopted language.
Thanks, Kim. I think I cover that later on, but if not, that's a good flag. Mary, go ahead.
Thanks. I just need to, on the inclination, can you guys explain a little bit? What I'm seeing on a lot of modern architecture is flat roofs. It seems to be even in the mountain communities. And would there be, for solar ready, can people do a ground mount? I mean, would we consider any kind of ground mount, like if they have the land? But what do we do with people that have strictly all flat roofs?
Elizabeth, I think you were planning to answer that question, so I might turn it to you.
Oh, yeah, that's very normal for commercial buildings to have a flat roof. So that's not a hindrance in any way. The solar array installation would account for that to, whether you're using a ballasted system or whatever, or a structure to create that angle. Roof slope in itself is not typically a problem, but this code does specifically refer to roof area. So ground mounted solar necessarily doesn't really have anything to do with this amendment or with this section of the code. Even if I had a ginormous solar array on the ground, I would still need to meet the solar ready portion of the roof code. If that's, I think that's what your question was.
It's not so, it's the new homes. The new style, modern style is a very flat roof. So that's what I'm seeing a little bit more in the high end homes.
Yeah, and I would say that's still very achievable.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not a problem. What would be looked at is that roof area shaded by trees and parapets and you know, all that good
Got
stuff.
it.
But not a problem.
Thank you.
Great. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tim Pate. I've got a different comment about roof area, but that comment on would a ground mount work, and in my opinion, we may look as a board to include an exception to say that if the building provided adequate ground mount solar that was providing the electricity for that particular building, that would meet what the intent is, and not just say, well, it's not on the roof, so you don't get it. That doesn't make any sense to me, but that'd be a suggestion coming up. But the other comment I have or question is, I'm not sure if there are any solar companies as part of the public listening to this, that we've got quite a few multifamily buildings in my jurisdiction in Broomfield that are 4 and 5 story tall, and they've got the section of roof that's the flat roof in the well with all the mechanical equipment, and it pretty well packs in all those units, especially when there are 300 air conditioning little tiny units that are all packed in there, because that's where they go up on the roof. And then they have a sloped, not a mansard, more of a mansard style, but maybe a 6-12 pitch going all the way around that would, from an aesthetic standpoint. And those might be maybe 8 or 10 foot slope, 6-12. And my question would be 4 or 5 stories tall, then to get your 40% or 60%, you'd have to utilize a lot of that area for the panels. And I know it can be done, but it would be interesting to get feedback from solar company as to, you know, how that works from maintenance, et cetera, et cetera.
Beth, were you going to answer that question, or?
I was just going to say how we would approach that for you guys, Tim. We would, with the way that the code is written, I would take that roof design and, you know, like we've got the bathtub with the condensers, right? And then some of that roof is going to be still solar friendly. You know, if it faces south and east and west, that would be designated as our solar ready zone. And then the slope that faces north would not. And the stuff that is too shaded by the bathtub walls would not. So that would be a case where, you know, if that area that's still available equals 40%, awesome. If not, that's when I would, you know, write the letter that says that we've maxed out our solar ready zone, but that some still could achieve that. Because we have the same problem in Denver, so we've had to do that.
So then it would go to the exception that you said, that you write the letter to say we're maxed out, and not say you need to provide it on that sloped area, or maybe I misunderstood.
The sloped area is still acceptable. I think there's actually a bit in the way that the code reads about what is an acceptable slope. But even 12-12 is an acceptable slope. So 6-12 or 8-12 would be no problem to have solar on it.
Okay, thank you.
Ron, go ahead.
So I like the idea of creating some sort of an exception that does account for people who maybe don't want to put solar on the roof, but have an appropriate place to put a ground mount system. I think that I certainly see a lot of our customers who approach things that way. And I don't think it's right to have them, you know, go through the process of creating a solar ready zone on this roof that they don't really want to use, and but instead it can do something on the ground. And that also might be something that's worth considering for those roofs where there's some reason why they maxed out their roof area, is maybe we also compel them to look a little bit at ground mount systems as well. So maybe there's a way to sort of deal with it from both perspectives that way.
Thanks, Kim at Lotus, for pointing out that that exemption already exists in the code language appendix. People may want to check the chat on that.
And thanks, Kristen. And I'll just clarify to that exception is for when ground mounted solar is already installed on site. To Ron's point, if there's the readiness aspect for a ground mount is not necessarily covered by the code language.
And it would probably need to be fairly specific, because ground mount systems often have other land use implications. So it would not just be, a section of open field, but something where it's been sort of formally designated for that purpose.
Go ahead.
Andrew here. So just the current discussion, is it more intended to be limited to commercial? I didn't want to necessarily raise a couple residential comments that may warrant a discussion on potential exceptions.
Yeah, so I mean, this presentation is specifically geared towards commercial, so I'm not sure that like all of these exact details are not going to directly apply to residential, because some of the residential language is different. But I don't think that prohibits us from discussing residential.
But I can hold off or wait, just at least on the residential aspect. I don't know to what extent the code language is intended to impact zoning language, that one or more homes may not fit, and one may have to, or may be forced to, limit their offerings or something that may conform but violate some other code, such as a zoning code. And I do know with certainty there are homes currently in the market that there is no roof whatsoever other than the roof for the access to the rooftop, because the rooftop is entirely a rooftop deck. So illustrations like those illustrations, I think Tim started to go a little bit down that, but no, otherwise I'm going to hold off till we get back to the residential. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Any further comments? Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. I'm forgetting if this who said this, but about making an exception for folks who maybe don't want to put the solar ready zone on their roof, but they would put some solar on the ground. Not sure I would fully support that, because again, this is just solar ready, not solar installed, and the things that have to do with solar ready are structural and a minimal electrical prep. That doesn't necessarily prohibit someone from using that roof for something else in the time being. All we're doing again is kind of like what we're talking about, the electric ready. We're doing this stuff that doesn't cost as much right now as it does cost down the road. We're not necessarily dictating how someone uses that roof until they, maybe a future owner puts solar up there.
Elizabeth, that's a helpful point. I really appreciate the discussion, and I love it. I think for time's sake, I'm sure all of these points will be discussed when we actually start discussing code elements too for inclusion. So unless anyone else has something that they would is a burning thought that they would like to share, I would suggest we move on. Okay, seeing none. So the next one is, we've kind of discussed it already, but very similar to residential obstructions. So the solar ready zones can't have any obstructions within the designated zone, which includes vents, chimneys, HVAC equipment, skylights, gardens, that sort of thing. I think Kim noted in the chat that green roofs actually did have that the amount of roof for consideration for the solar ready zone, excluded spaces that were already had vegetation on them. So that's still, I guess, any solar ready zone still can't have vegetation within it, but the vegetation that may exist on a roof can be excluded from the designation of a solar ready zone. And then Denver allows solar water heating equipment to be located in the solar zone, seeing as it is related to the solar thermal system. But they were kind of the only jurisdiction that allowed a specific obstruction to be located within the zone. Interconnection pathways, I'm sure a lot of this is ringing bells like crazy. Much like the residential, electrical interconnection pathways for conduit, wiring, plumbing, etc., have to be identified at a minimum. The location of those and how they will connect between the solar ready zone and the panel or the water heater, depending on the system. And that they must be noted on construction documents. One thing I will bring up that we discussed last time that is not really reflected in a lot of the jurisdictions codes that have been adopted, but a question that was discussed about whether or not to require that the conduit, wiring, and or plumbing would actually have to be installed as opposed to just identified. So just bringing that up for a point, that reminding that we did discuss that relating to residential construction for solar ready as well. And Kim, you kind of beat me to it, but energy storage reserved areas. So the IECC appendix does include a requirement that an area be designated of a certain size for a future energy storage system. This is unique to the commercial appendix. This is not included in the residential appendix. And all jurisdictions that have adopted the provision have adopted the same language that the IECC language included. So a system that has a space for the system that has to be at least 2 feet by 4 feet in size, and it has to have be indicated on the construction documents. And then Boulder and Crested Butte, seeing as they adopted different codes than the IECC, also did not adopt any specific provision like this as well. So it's limited only to the jurisdictions that adopted the IECC Appendix CB as it was. Electric panel reserved space, very similar to the residential, requiring that there be space provided on the electrical panel for a circuit breaker to prepare both for solar PV, but also for energy storage. So that is one way it differs, is that it also requires panel space to be reserved for a potential electric storage system as well as the solar. Labeling, as Kim noted, the circuit breakers have to be reserved specifically for that purpose for both solar PV and the electric storage, and that the location of the circuit breakers are to be on the opposite end of the panel from the main supply. Unique provisions, Boulder requires a minimum electrical panel bus bar rate. So they were the only ones that have that specific requirement, as well as how much service the circuit breaker should be able to handle. And then Denver required panel space for either a 2 or 3 pole circuit breaker, whereas most of the other jurisdictions required only a dual pole breaker requirement size for sizing. And then Crested Butte's, I guess I should just note on Crested Butte's language, it's a little bit, it doesn't require a lot of these necessarily specific provisions. It is more general language in stating that buildings must comply and be solar ready. So there's not necessarily a specific, like it has to have, a solar ready zone or interconnection pathways identified or reserved space. It just is more direct. So you'll see them as kind of an exception in a lot of cases on these. Construction documentation, very similar. They must identify where the solar zone is, must add a dead load of 5 pounds per square foot to the calculations for making sure that they are that the dead load calculations are sufficient, and then that they must be identified beyond on the construction documents, and then that a certificate must be provided in an obvious location that includes the location of the solar zone, interconnection pathways, energy storage area, and any other requirements. And then Boulder has one unique aspect to that, in that it requires the building owner to provide, basically to pass down a certificate and construction documents to the next homeowner or building owner when the building is sold. So are there any questions on commercial solar readiness? I know that there were a lot of similarities between that and residential solar readiness, but there were some unique elements. And so wondering if anyone has questions or want to discuss any of those. All right, well, seeing none, I guess we can move on to discussion about residential electric ready codes. So there is some, I would say there is more variation among electric ready and certainly among EV ready codes among jurisdictions that have adopted them across the state than there were relating to solar ready provisions. However, there are a lot of similarities that we will note here. So just to get us started, kind of back to an overview. So 7 jurisdictions in the state have adopted some form of electric ready or electric preferred energy code, with the list being there. And as I noted earlier, Erie is likely to adopt, so I did include them on the list, even though they have not actually officially adopted yet. And as noted earlier, Crested Butte is the first jurisdiction in the state to adopt an all electric requirement. So it's not electric ready, but all electric required. So they go ahead, Kim.
Oh, Adam, thanks. I was just going to add, we got word today that the Louisville Council last night adopted a commercial construction code requiring all electric space and water heating, but that happened yesterday. So that can be added to our list.
Thank you. Yeah, I did not get that word, so I appreciate you flagging that. Carolyn, go ahead.
Just a question. I think in this context, you're referring to the broader electric ready rather than the EV.
Right. So this is electric ready for like within the space of the home, as opposed to not. So EV readiness will be discussed separately because there are a lot of differences there. And I also didn't want to limit us in time because especially commercial EV readiness has a lot of very difficult components and very unique components, unlike a lot of other portions of the code. So I wanted to leave specific time for those, a unique discussion on those. So we will move on. So applicable equipment, I think for, especially within residential buildings, there are 4 very common systems and pieces of equipment that this does apply to. And then there are a couple of jurisdictions that have also adopted it for lighting. So the most common ones are for space heating, water heating, cooking, clothes drying, and then, as I said, Louisville, Superior, and potentially Erie. Their codes also include electric readiness for any lighting that would use a non-electric fuel. Common exceptions among this is, I think it's most common for multifamily structures, so either townhomes or multifamily buildings that are less than 3 stories, but space heating or water heating systems at a certain capacity or higher that serve multiple dwelling units, so that are not limited just to one, are often exempted from the requirements. Electrical infrastructure requirements. So the electric ready and preferred codes include most commonly include the following infrastructure requirements, specifically that combustion equipment, which is anything using a fossil fuel, is specifically defined in most of these codes as any system that is using a fossil fuel for providing the heat are required to have a junction box or other receptacle installed within a certain distance of the equipment that is currently installed that is not electric. So the distance from the actual equipment is one area in which the codes often differ. Some say that they have to, the junction box or receptacle has to be as close as 1 foot to the designated space for the existing appliance, and the highest was that they could be as far away as 6 feet from the existing system or appliance. And then some of the codes do weigh in on specific capacity requirements for the junction box or receptacle, while others just say that more general language that it just has to be able to support an electric equivalent to whatever the non-electric system that is currently installed is capable of providing. So there are some that require specific voltage and amperage requirements, where others are more general. And then they are, of course, required to be labeled that the purpose of the junction box or the receptacle is for future installation of an electric appliance in that space. Pause there and see if there's any questions. All right, not seeing any. So panel capacity and reserve space.
Sorry, Adam, can you go back to the exception for multifamily units? So what would that exception, what would that be? Meaning that we couldn't do heat pumps? They wouldn't be required to do heat pumps? I guess I need a little bit more clarification on that exception.
Yeah, so if there was a, I guess a smaller multifamily building, I guess, that utilizes either one like central furnace that heats multiple dwelling units, or a water system, kind of a centralized water system that provides water to all units, that they would not have to be provided with the junction box or any other kind of electric readiness equipment in new buildings. So if the design of the building was to have a system that is serving multiple units, and there were minimum capacity requirements, I'm not remembering exactly what they were, what the numbers specifically were, but minimum capacity requirements and serving multiple dwelling units, many of the adopted codes have exempted those from electric readiness requirements.
So basically they could, what we see in most multifamily units, at least in the mountains, are they have a centralized boiler system for space heating and water heating, and we'd allow that to continue going in, is what I'm hearing you say. Is that correct?
Yes, and to clarify, this code would allow that to continue going in regardless. It just determines whether or not electric readiness infrastructure is also required to be constructed at the same time. So the electric ready code isn't necessarily saying you have to build with electric appliances. You can still use gas, you can still install boilers, but that electric readiness infrastructure has to be paired with it. And so this is just saying that in these situations that they don't have to be paired with it. And again, this is not intended to necessarily say that it's the right or wrong approach. It's just this is what a lot of jurisdictions.
What a lot of them say. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Kristen, you had your hand up.
I do. I used to live in one of these units up in the high Rockies, and found myself in a position where I wanted to install a mini split heat pump and couldn't. So I was just curious, have any of the adopted codes had a provision that in multifamily units such as this, where they're individually owned, that individual unit owners may by right, install electrification if they want to. One of the common things people run into is, HOA documents that prohibit attachments, for example. So I don't know, just something for people to consider. Should we be saying, okay, if you choose to do a fossil fueled new construction in a multifamily condo development, for instance, you shall not prohibit individual owners from going electric if they so choose.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, did anyone have any further comments or questions? Chris, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say briefly that that is a compelling thought because I find myself in the same situation. So I appreciate Kristen bringing that up.
Good luck, Chris.
Mary?
There is a House bill, and I've got to look it up, that does, with energy efficiency, and heat pumps are considered energy efficiency, that HOA cannot deny somebody to put in a heat pump unless, and this is what the caveat is, unless it's in the common areas. So I have had one customer who got denied because their HOA didn't like the look of the heat pump. So it's just something that we should be aware of as this is new construction and stuff, is we got to make sure that whatever we decide, that people have that option if they want to go with the heat pump.
Mary. And I will note that Kevin dropped in the chat. So Denver yesterday agreed to move forward with their 2021 IBC and IECC amendments, so long as they consider a potential for all electric requirements in the future. But as of now, if the code moves forward, it would still only be electric readiness required as opposed to all electric required, except for in commercial buildings to some extent, which we can touch on a little bit later when we talk about the commercial stuff. But Kevin, I don't know if you had any further comments on that.
No, it got a little lively. I mean, I think after the Denver Code Committee worked on that for, gosh, nearly a year, it felt like the whole thing might not go through because people wanted more from it. It was interesting. Elizabeth was on the call as well and spoke towards it. There's also a lot of talk about the electric vehicle requirements. So that's an active discussion. That may evolve still for Denver as we add to this list of municipalities.
Yeah, and just one clarification, since there was a lot of talk about multifamily in the context of this would be townhome style multifamily, because like the condos and apartments are all in the commercial code. Not everybody's familiar with that distinction, so I just wanted to share that if it can exit to the outside, so it doesn't have a shared internal access point, it's in the residential code. If it looks like you're coming through an interior entryway or shared space like a condo or apartment building, it falls in the commercial. So just wanted to make that distinction for those who might not be as familiar with that.
Thanks, Carolyn. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I was going to say, Carolyn, I think that's unless a jurisdiction has amended the definition, all R2 that is 3-story and below would fall under the residential section of the IECC. And then R2 that's 4-story and above, so multifamily 4-story and above would fall under the commercial. But some folks have amended that, like Boulder's amended that, Denver's amended that. I don't know if anybody else has though. So there is some multifamily that this
Right.
would
That's good clarification. Yeah, just making sure that we're treating them in both spaces because they will show up in both spaces.
Yeah, great point.
Further comments or questions on any of that we've covered so far? Okay, seeing none. Let's see, where were we? I think we were on going to commercial electric ready codes. So I think as I mentioned earlier, you will see a lot of common themes that relate very similarly to the residential, but there are some differences. One difference is that one of our jurisdictions that had residential electric ready requirements does not have commercial ready requirements. I'll be honest, I don't remember which one it is, but there's one of them that does not. So that list is there. And then Denver, as I noted earlier, for commercial buildings does still have partial electrification requirements in commercial buildings only. So I presume, this is all based on their 2021 proposed adopted code. So the code hasn't necessarily been fully adopted yet by the Denver City Council, but presuming that it is on track to do so, that is what this is based on. And then, as I noted earlier, Crested Butte is all electric as well for commercial. Applicable equipment, pretty much the same thing, same list: space heating, water heating, cooking, clothes drying, and lighting. That use non-electric fuel sources. I think the major difference here is the common exceptions. So in many cases, the similar space heating or water heating systems over a certain capacity, so much like the residential, except that obviously we're not dealing with dwelling units here, so it doesn't specifically apply only to dwelling units, but just generally systems that are centralized within buildings over certain capacities were not required in many of the codes to have electric ready components associated with it. The two major ones that do not generally apply to residential construction are commercial cooking equipment. I'm sure you all have probably read an article at some point or another about Berkeley and the Restaurants Association that is suing the city of Berkeley for banning natural gas, and that includes commercial cooking equipment. And so I would expect that a lot of jurisdictions decided not to wade into that fight and have exempted commercial cooking equipment from those requirements. Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tim Pate. With the list that you are showing, and which ones of those are enforcing it on like commercial alterations, or is it just strictly new construction? I was just reading through that council memo from Louisville, which is that was shared through the chat that got approved last night, and pretty interesting that that's one of our neighbors. So kind of sure my city council members will be reading that very soon.
Yeah, I do not have the answer to that question, but if anyone else in the group may know more, feel free to speak up.
Tim, I'm sorry, I missed your question. Do you mind repeating that? I'm so sorry.
Not a problem. So the list for on the commercial jurisdictions that have adopted these requirements, are they all I'm sorry, how to put that? Is it just for new build, new commercial, or include alteration?
I believe it's just for new builds, but I can check the Louisville specific language right now. I've got the ordinance pulled up, see if I can't find the answer.
I think I glanced through, I think Louisville's capturing both, but it's more of this list like Basalt, Denver, there's not that many. So the reason I bring it up is as the board moves forward on a commercial, to make the decisions of, will the commercial EV ready just be for new commercial, or will we have that second component for alteration, and then how's that going to look? So I think that will help guide us.
Yeah, I know that a number of the codes did weigh in on additions having to comply, but I don't know specifically about alterations of existing space, whether or not they all weighed in on that.
Yeah,
Carolyn?
some of us define the level of alteration that triggers what's effectively the new construction. And so a gut would typically be treated like new construction from a Boulder code.
I think somewhere I read where they tie that to the IEBC, the existing building code, where they have the different levels of alteration too. So, and as we move forward and kind of get into the weeds, the details, I think that'll be something we'll want to put on the table.
Thanks, Tim, for bringing that up. Okay, so yeah, and then the third, in addition to the commercial cooking equipment that we just discussed, a lot of industrial and manufacturing equipment is also exempted because in many cases there are not appropriate electric alternatives to current fueled systems. And so in many cases, codes decided to exempt industrial and manufacturing equipment. So most of this is the same as residential, but some of it does differ in certain ways. Electrical infrastructure requirements, I think all of this was pretty much identical to the residential side. Just certain, installation of junction box or receptacle requirements. The distances, again, had ranges, capacity of a junction box to, whether it had to just meet the existing or whatever the fossil fuel equipment would provide the equivalent load for that, or specific load requirements. So pretty much the same as residential. Carolyn?
Yeah, so on the previous one about the placement, so within the space and water heating, I just, recall from a lot of the stakeholder engagement that went in leading into the legislation. This seems to be one of the most challenging ones within the commercial space, depending on the type of building and the selected heating configuration. And so I feel like in this particular space is where you're going to see the most projects that would trigger kind of the cost effectiveness threshold would be one of my concerns, or one that they would use. And just thinking about, I think the capacity requirement, and this one should be somewhat separated to make sure that at a minimum, we're still planning for future panel space, recognizing that different configurations may have more complexity when it comes, and obviously Elizabeth's more expert in how you design, but that was a lot of the feedback we were getting into, as far as like, stranded investment and things that might not be as easily retrofittable. And so I think this is a space we might want to spend just a little bit of time with some expertise hearing, because I think this is the one that I've heard the most concern around, is specifically the space heating issue, not the water heating or cooking or the other appliances, but really specifically the space heating.
And specifically for retrofit?
No, for the amount of infrastructure that would need to be put in, depending on the degree to which they've got zonal heating and other things. And again, I'm just recalling some of the things that were flagged during that conversation. And so there may be some best practices or analysis that I haven't had a chance to look at, but I do feel like this is the one that's been the biggest trigger that I've heard from the community about moving towards electric ready. So just wanted to flag that.
Carolyn, Will?
Yeah, and I was just going to agree with Carolyn, having been very involved in the discussions and negotiation on the legislative language. Really, the reason that the language about a potential waiver process that communities would have the option of adopting based upon cost effectiveness for commercial and multifamily, it was all about this piece. That discussion wasn't coming from either the solar ready or EV ready, but was very focused on concerns that folks from the building community were bringing forward, that for some types of buildings, it could be quite complicated and expensive, depending upon how they're setting up their heating systems. So I would agree with Carolyn that I think this will be probably the trickiest area for us to get right in this first round of solar and electric ready codes.
Thanks, Will. Kevin?
Following up on that intent from the legislation, Will, with home rule state and what we adopt, it ultimately being somehow in conflict with what other municipalities have, and maybe that's a way down the line question for us, but is it possible that, or maybe is it's available now, that in addition to this summary, there's sort of something that puts what folks in the state have done side by side. So a table that says, here's what these things do, so that we understand when we try to put together a whole new state code, how does that interrelate or conflict with or supplement the existing separate codes that are out there now? Maybe it's a question for later. I'm fine to table it, but just as you mentioned that, curious as to how we'll navigate that down the line.
So I think it's a very interesting, point, and one that we can certainly discuss more. Remember that the language in the statute essentially says that these are minimum code requirements, and that jurisdictions may adopt codes that would be, more lead to higher levels of energy efficiency, renewables, or electrification. So a jurisdiction that has adopted code elements that go further than the statewide minimum, they would certainly be allowed to do that. And my understanding of it is that when it comes to the language about waivers for commercial buildings, that again, that would be something that local governments would have the the option of including because it would be part of the statewide base, but that since if you did not include that, you would be going sort of further towards energy efficiency, electrification, and renewables, that local governments would not be required to adopt it.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on that, I think the language specifically says create a process to waive energy code requirements. It doesn't necessarily say that local jurisdictions have to do that when they adopt it. It's just that we will be developing a process that they can choose to adopt if they want, along with the code. Any further questions or discussion on that point? Great. So let's see. Much like the residential codes, again, seeing very common themes here. Requiring dedicated circuit breakers for those newly installed junction boxes, and then that they must have, that the panel itself must actually have the capacity that it needs in order to, even though obviously this is only requiring electric ready, basically anticipating that a homeowner, or in this case a building owner, would go all electric, that the panel must be able to have the capacity to meet the need of a future all electric system. Tim?
Yeah, thank you, Tim Pate. Can you explain a little bit just what a combustion system would cover, please?
So a combustion system, most of I think the definitions typically was based on combustion equipment, not a combustion system. I just use that phrase. But that combustion equipment is pretty much anything that uses any appliance or system that uses fuel oil, fuel gas, something of that nature in order to provide heat as opposed to electricity. And as I said earlier, I didn't include it in this presentation, but most of the jurisdictions did actually explicitly define that term so that it's clearer when it's being used. So noted we kind of discussed some of these already, but noted some primary differences between the commercial and residential requirements for electric ready. So we talked about cooking already, just a lot of tension around commercial cooking equipment and whether or not it should be required to be electrified. Of course, the code isn't requiring it to be electrified, but even surrounding the conversation relating to electric readiness oftentimes gets very touchy, and I think some jurisdictions have chosen to not wade into that fight. We talked about industrial and manufacturing already, and then efficiency. Some jurisdictions for commercial buildings did require that combustion equipment installed. So it's not necessarily requiring that electric. It's not saying you have to install electric, but it's saying that if you do install a combustion equipment instead of an electric system, that those have to meet higher thresholds of energy efficiency than an equivalent electric system would have to. So there have been discussions about that, weighing into the base code to the IECC itself about, developing those additional efficiency menu, essentially, about identifying areas in which you can make improvements, and one of those often includes that all electric systems don't necessarily always have to meet the same efficiency thresholds as combustion equipment systems do, and so some of these codes do actually weigh in on that as well. Tim?
Yeah, sorry, Tim Pate. I recall quite a bit of, discussions from the Department of Energy, who set those national efficiency standards. And it was my understanding, and I don't know how this plays on the local jurisdiction, requiring the higher efficiency, and what the current stance is from the Department of Energy, who does set those minimum standards for efficiency on those appliances, such as a water heater or an air conditioner unit. So if we're going to do something possibly at the state level, I don't know if we are going to go down this path. It'd be interesting to see what the federal government stance is.
Yeah, I would say that I would note that there's the major difference between that and the code, I think, is that DOE is setting the minimum requirements for any product to be manufactured, right? That it has to be that there are minimum efficiency thresholds for manufacturing of certain product classes of all of these different types of equipment, but not necessarily saying that you can't require a higher type of efficiency version of that equipment being installed in a building. It doesn't necessarily weigh in on that. And so I'm not sure. I mean, it's definitely something we could inquire about. But I think that there's a pretty significant distinction in that it's not dissimilar from saying that, you know, they still allow manufacturing of non-LED light bulbs, and yet even though most LED light bulbs that are manufactured and installed today are LEDs, so it's more of the minimum setting than what the requirements in a code would be, I guess, is my point. Will?
Thank you.
Adam, I just wanted to make sure that I understood that last bullet. Since typically the electric equipment that we would be talking about would be high efficiency electric equipment, things like heat pumps that are going to have, you know, efficiencies of more than 100%. I'm trying to understand.
Yeah,
exactly what we need in this context.
Yeah, I'm thinking perhaps the wording of it was maybe I should have left off higher than their electric counterparts. I guess more what I meant to say is there are specific additional efficiency requirements for combustion equipment.
Okay.
If it's chosen over electric equipment, not necessarily trying to imply that the electric equipment wouldn't also be as or more efficient than its counterparts. Just trying to say that the specific additional requirements in the code only applied to combustion equipment.
Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion? Kim?
It does just bring up a question that we have talked about locally here, just wanting to make sure that we are encouraging efficient electrical equipment such as heat pumps in lieu of like baseboard heating. And I didn't know, this may be beyond the topic of right now, but I just was curious as to whether the codes kind of had a consideration of the distinguishment between different types of electric equipment.
Yeah, so I believe it was Denver's new code that they're considering adoption. So not only did it require partial electrification of space heating and cooling, space heating and water heating, but it also did explicitly say that electric resistance heating is not allowed except under certain situations, certain exception situations. So I don't know if, and I don't recall if other jurisdictions had that, but I very clearly remember that Denver did do that. And maybe Elizabeth raised her hand, so maybe she has more to add on.
Yeah, even under current codes, if someone was to do an all electric building or, you know, install electric heating, it would be pretty impossible to meet those codes with electric heating only, like only baseboard heat. Like there's really no way you could document code compliance with that. So I don't know that has to explicitly be prohibited. I don't know that we want to prohibit baseboard heating as a supplemental heat, which would be permitted, because that certainly has its uses here and there. That could be something that, like Denver is adopted or written into the amendments with certain jurisdictions. But I don't think we have to worry that this kind of thing is encouraging electric resistance heating as the only heat source. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Kim.
It does. Thank you. I just kind of wanted to bring it into the topic for now or future consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Brad?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just add on to that, just to provide a little bit of info. We in Fort Collins did specify that it needs to be done with heat pump technology. We do allow electric resistance heat at temperatures 15 degrees and below, and we also allow electric resistance heat if they can model the house what would essentially be passive house standards. So we'll say 6 kBTU. I think it's 6 kBTU per square foot. So we do allow residential heat or residential electric resistance heat.
And I would note too, in the discussions relating to the 2024 IECC, as well as some other jurisdictions, individual amendments, they've talked about backup heating sources and requiring controls on a heat pump system so that it makes sure that the heat pump is by far the most prominently used system, and that those backup systems, whether they be electric or non-electric, are only used in the extreme circumstances where the heat pump isn't able to meet the load or meet the demand. So a lot of the codes are definitely starting to weigh into that aspect as well. Will, did you have another question, or did you just forget to drop your hand? Okay, just making sure. Mary?
Just a quick question. As Colorado gets a little hotter in the summer, even in the mountains, we're seeing more cooling added, and that obviously is an advantage of a heat pump system. It does both heating and cooling very efficiently. And granted, space and water heating are over 50% of people's utility bills. But I think we also have to kind of consider, as Colorado heats up, the more need, and also against wildfire smoke, people need to keep their windows closed now. That the cooling load is probably going to increase quite significantly in the state over the next 10 years.
Totally agree, Mary. I think the timing of that comment is a little bit not great, seeing as tomorrow's high, I think, is 1 degree. But
just
that is an exception to the
I know. Yes, I agree. And the other thing, that just knowing that the calls I get is that we all have heard about equity, energy equity, and that whatever code we decide on, let's remember that these homeowners and these tenants are going to be paying these utility bills over the life of that building. So let's make sure that it's equitable for everybody.
Thanks, Mary. Anything else anyone wanted to add? I think, if I recall, I had one more slide, but I was going to say, I think I'm pretty much at the end of my presentation, but I do have one more. And I think we've pretty much hit on these throughout our discussion today, but as I noted, Denver is expected to require electrification, and as we noted, excluding resistance heating for space heating and water heating in their 2022 code, based on what happened yesterday with the potential gas ban that could change to become all electric required in the next. I think they said late spring was when they were trying to potentially reevaluate on that. So that could change in the next 6 months to a year, but for now, that is what it looks like they are moving forward within their 2022 cycle. With the exceptions, of course, for buildings that require emergency supplemental heat, as well as supplemental heating systems that are built into heat pump systems. There was a long list of requirements, but those are certainly the most prominent ones. And then Crested Butte, as we've noted kind of throughout today, requires all electric construction for all new commercial and residential buildings. And they do require, I forget what level of alteration it is, maybe Jason can jump in here, but what level of alteration requires electric readiness as well. If they do a certain level of alterations or additions, they do require electric readiness for those.
It's a level 3 alteration or any addition that meets the specific requirements around installing gas heating, water heating, cooking, or dryer.
Good. Okay, well, now I think that's all I had. So so open up to any further discussion, final questions, and I guess it looks like we'll be able to give everyone a few minutes of their day back today. So
can I have a quick question on one of your last slides? Adam,
yes.
You mentioned
this one, or
and again, I don't think it's necessary, but you mentioned the efficiency of appliance efficiency requirement in the commercial.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if somebody had a clarification on our preemption specific to commercial appliances. We had a question in the Q&A around that as well. I know on the residential, we're preempted from specifying appliance efficiency, but since you saw it, I was now curious as to if that does not exist in the commercial space or if there's allowances for it.
As far as I've been able to tell, this only applied in commercial spaces, but I don't want to weigh in exclusively on that if someone else has further thoughts, or if that was actually answering your question.
No, I know for sure it's not in the residential. I was just curious if it just hadn't been challenged, or if or if we really weren't preempted in the commercial space. And I like if somebody could share that, maybe Kim, I don't know if you have the opportunity to look into that and share that as well. But I think that would be helpful information.
Yeah, Carolyn,
it's more anecdotal than specific, but it came up and I saw it in the Q&A as well. So
I am, I'm happy to look into it. I'm trying to recall the conversations we had with the Boulder County Code cohort, because I believe for Louisville and Superior specifically, you know, the requirement is that if you install natural gas, it kicks in higher efficiency requirements for the equipment. So, but because there's an option to go all electric and just meet the federal minimum, that it doesn't go against the preemption. So because you have the option, but I can triple check on that and get back to the group.
Carolyn, having worked at DOE's building tech office, I believe you are correct in your concern about federal preemption wherever the federal government has promulgated a federal standard, but there are certain categories of appliances where the federal government has not issued standard, in which case preemption wouldn't apply. But point well taken, and my suggestion would be that we aim for flexible alternatives that do not require specific appliance efficiency standard levels, if that would open the state up to legal challenge.
I can add that in Boulder County, we dealt with this issue by just making sure there was a variety of pathways so that we weren't compelling somebody to buy a equipment that was more efficient than the federal standards.
Super.
Seems to have worked.
Awesome. Any further discussions or questions on these, or I guess, you know, we can open it up to broader questions, you know, future scheduling questions, how we're going to proceed. That all fair game. So if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to raise them. All right, well, I'm not hearing any, so don't want to keep you all any longer than we have to. I really appreciate you all attending today. I think we had really good attendance today from the board, so you know, really appreciate you all taking the time, especially knowing that we are approaching the holidays and many people may have been planning to take today off. So I do apologize for that. I just wanted to make sure we could squeeze in one meeting in December, given our expedited timeline for getting this first code done. Our next meeting will be January 11th. Let me confirm the time. I believe it is 12 to 3 p.m., but let me confirm. Yes, Wednesday, January 11th from 12 to 3 p.m. So between now and then, please feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, or any other things you would like to raise with us. And Kim and I will definitely put our heads together and make sure we're getting you all everything you need. So if there aren't any further questions or comments, thanks everybody, and have a happy holidays.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy solstice.